One of the aspects of Attack on Titan that I love the most is the way it recontextualizes its story. The series has no shortage of depth to its characters and writing, but throughout the course of its plot, the addition of new information retroactively frames prior events in a new light, often giving scenes completely new weight and meanings in retrospect. Author Hajime Isayama capitalizes off of his story to the fullest extent by infusing narrative parallels that give greater weight after experiencing more of the story. He recontextualizes the plot in ways both big and small several times throughout the series, and one instance where I believe he strongly does this is showcased through the characters of Sasha and Gaby. Their stories ultimately reflect some of the greater narratives within Attack on Titan by directly paralleling with each other in a unique way. Sasha had already established herself as an endearing character in the beginning of the series, but her backstory within chapter 36 greatly helps flesh her out in a way that coincides with the larger themes of the narrative. Her side story focuses on her return to her home village for the first time in 3 years, while saving a little girl from a Titan in the process. Throughout this chapter, we get 2 important flashbacks, one being of her and her father, and the other being a conversation between Historia and Ymir. Both of these flashbacks do a great job at giving depth to her character, and also provide great examples of how Attack on Titan manages to recontextualize even the smallest of moments. Sasha's conversation with her father shows how the two live their lives in the outskirts of town in a village whose natural forests and wildlife have been decreasing due to the people who have lost their homes to Titans, and them having continuously repurposed the area to take new shelter. Sasha feels discontent with the outsiders having moved in and disrupted her way of life, becoming even more aggressive when her father suggests the idea of giving up their way of life as hunters, equating it to giving up who they are. This directly ties with the second flashback, where Ymir questions why Sasha obviously tries to hide her country accent and way of speech that she's developed from living in the outskirts of town. Ymir points out Sasha's insecurities about her speech compared to those who live within the inner cities, which stems from her fears and lack of understanding of outsiders. After pointing this out, Ymir reprimands Sasha and encourages her to speak how she feels most comfortable, with Historia stressing that Sasha doesn't have to change if she doesn't want to just because someone else had told her to, and that what truly matters is that she acts and lives for herself on her own accord. When looking at these scenes for the first time, the initial message is one of self-acceptance and learning to care for others. Sasha refuses to give up her way of life in the forest, a lifestyle that she and her family before had maintained, but initially it largely comes from a place of not wanting to change out of anger from the outsiders that have been threatening her normal way of life. While we later learn that Sasha's father sent her to the scouts out of recognition that she wouldn't be able to live her entire life as a hunter within the forest, it's reasonable to assume that her personal reasons for joining could largely be to get rid of the Titans so that the outsiders could leave her village and she can return to her normal way of living. But Sasha's father questions her and if she's willing to give up her whole life just to live for herself. He stresses that whether they like it or not, humans can't live alone, and everyone in this world is connected to each other. Living an insular life and potentially dying for it would go against his wish to see his family grow and live into the future, regardless of whether or not they have to hold all of their traditions and way of life in order to see that. The flashback ends with Sasha's father asking her if it really would be so difficult for her to leave the forest and face other people, and we see these insecurities manifest in the interaction with Historia and Ymir, where ironically, it's the same outsiders that Sasha was so nervous and afraid of that encourage her to be her true self. This moment not only gives her the confidence to be herself when around others, but also drastically changes her perception towards those who live outside the village. This culminates in her side story, where she returns to her home village for the first time in 3 years since the conversation she had with her father. Immediately, she recognizes a completely new village that wasn't part of the forest from before, telling herself that she'll never be able to go home. Her village has no doubt changed within the time that she was gone, which is a fear that she had before she had left. It's as if her home is almost unrecognizable now. Within this new village, a girl who we know later as Kaya watches hopelessly as a Titan eats her mother, who is unable to escape from the rest of the village. Given that she's living in this new village, Kaya is an outsider, a part of the same group of outsiders that Sasha detested for moving in and destroying the forest. But even with knowing this, Sasha doesn't hesitate to risk her life fighting the Titan to save her, doing exactly what her father questioned if she would be willing and ready to do. Her act of saving Kaya shows Sasha's growth in accepting that regardless of where we come from, we're all human. During this encounter, Kaya, despite being distraught and traumatized, asks Sasha why her speech is so polite and formal. This shows that even despite being an outsider, she's become aware of the dialect and the culture of the people that originally lived in the village. And when Sasha realizes this, her natural accent eventually breaks through after remembering her conversation with Ymir and Historia. She internally learns and recognizes that even though she was an outsider, she still recognized aspects of Sasha's culture. Sasha manages to fend off the Titan after sending Kaya to run for help, eventually running into her father for the first time since their conversation. After learning of what Sasha did to save Kaya, Sasha's father acknowledges that she's grown into a fine woman. And after hearing this, Sasha acknowledges that she is finally home. She's grown and recognized that her father was trying to teach her that home isn't always the place you live or the way you live your life, but rather the people that you love, and the importance of being able to see other people as equals and extend a helping hand and protect them. This is a strong moment of character growth and progression for Sasha on its own, but it's only heightened even more when viewed with the context of later events in the story. Sasha's conflict of learning to live with outsiders directly lines up with the geopolitical conflict that's later unveiled in the story between the people of the island of Parody and the warring nation of Marley. The struggles of interacting with people from wildly different groups and the long-term inherent stigmas and biases that result from it becomes an immensely large part of Attack on Titan's narrative themes, with the people of Parody being labeled as devils and made the enemies of the entire world by Marley, despite none of the people on Parody being responsible for the violence and horrors that their ancestors committed that Marley continuously reminds the world of. Nor are the people on Parody even aware of the truth of the past, due to having their memories wiped by the founding Titan. Sasha's father asks her if she's willing to put her life on the line for upholding her way of life, and in a sense she does. And because of it, her life is taken by someone whose circumstances uniquely parallel with her own, and that person being Gaby. Gaby is an Eldian born in Marley, a superpower nation that has long spread and enforced a narrative that demonizes Eldians for the crimes they've committed in the past, using their Titan powers to conquer territories and subjugate people for their benefit. Gaby has grown up in the ghetto with her own people being subject to discrimination and violent segregation. But through the Marleyan warrior unit, Gaby has a chance to become an honorary Marleyan and redeem herself and her family by becoming a child soldier and inheriting one of the 9 Titans to fight and oppress other nations for Marley's benefit, including her own people on Parody. Gaby has adopted Marleyan propaganda and brainwashing as truth, and wants nothing more than to prove herself as an honorary Marleyan and redeem herself and her family. Her perspective of the world has become so warped from the culture and ideology imposed on her that she sees the Eldians living on the island of Parody as irredeemable devils. Her hate is only further fueled after the attack of Liberia, where she's forced to watch her friends die due to Aaron and Parody's attack on Marley that was only prompted by Marley's unwillingness to bend on their viewpoint of Eldians and Parody as a whole. During this raid, Sasha actively makes the choice to spare Gaby, and while it highlights her growth as a character with how she actively chose yet again to save an innocent outsider, it ultimately leads to her death as Gaby later, fueled by her hate, takes Sasha's life. The story clearly highlights and draws similarities between Sasha and Gaby, both from their similar designs, but especially from the way they go through journeys of self-acceptance and understanding others. Gaby's hate directly mirrors the distaste that Sasha once had towards outsiders of her village, and the lesson of Sasha understanding that outsiders of the forest were ultimately still people parallels Gaby's journey of understanding that the Eldians on Parody are no different from her. Gaby also parallels Sasha's growth of self-acceptance through her coming to terms with the fact that there is no difference between her and the Eldians that she was told to despise. Gaby desperately tries to cling onto the lies and self-judgment imposed on her, going so far as to violently break down when Falco tries to take her armband that the Marleyans used to label her as an Eldian, claiming that without the mark of segregation and the endorsement of Marley that indoctrinized her to believe justified her existence, she's she's no different from the devils of Parody. She justifies this hate for Eldians on Parody through the raid on Liberio and the sins of her past ancestors. But after she escapes from her imprisonment with Falco, her worldview crumbles as she's forced to recognize that the Eldians on Parody aren't devils, but genuine human beings. And the people that help show her this are none other than the family of Sasha, the girl that Gaby took the life of, and Kaya, the one that Sasha saved. Gaby learns through ways both big and small that there are genuine, good-hearted Eldians within the walls, but this lesson isn't learned easily. Years of indoctrination has caused her to believe that everyone in Parody is deep down a despicable being, so much so that she genuinely breaks when treated with genuine kindness by the Blouse family. But the true start of her transformation comes from one especially powerful scene between Kaya, Gaby, and Falco within the ruins of the house where Kaya's mom was eaten alive. Kaya at this point actively knows that Falco and Gaby are from Marley from overhearing their conversation, but still chooses to take them in and protect them as a result of wanting to be like Sasha, the woman who saved her. It's within this moment where Falco and Gaby get a first-hand look at the damage and torment caused by Marley's acts of turning Eldians into mindless titans. Still unable to come to grips with Gaby's hatred for Parody and her own people, Kaya asks her what her mom did to deserve to die the way she did. Gaby responds with the same answer that she was indoctrinated with from before, that Eldians were responsible for thousands of years of oppression and cultural genocide, and that the people within the walls were still responsible for it. But Kaya tears down this argument by showing how her mom wasn't and couldn't have been responsible for anything that Gaby claims the devils of Parody were responsible for. Even with the very real reason to be upset about the attack on Liberio, she's forced to come to the realization that not every single Eldian on Parody was responsible nor wanted that violence. Gaby is forced to contend that everything she had been taught and believed, all of her biases and judgments upon not only Eldians, but even herself, were lies. This is further cemented when after Falco explains to Kaya why her mom died and apologizes for it, she thanks him, but says that it doesn't make sense for him to apologize because he was only born in Marley and wasn't responsible for the actual act of creating and sending the Titans. Just like how no Eldian currently living is responsible for the crimes their ancestors committed hundreds of years ago. This growth from Gaby uniquely poses a different perspective on the theme of identity, as while Sasha defined herself positively by honoring the traditions of her ancestors and their hunter way of life, Gaby defined herself negatively by placing the blame of her ancestors' actions on herself and believing that she had to atone for the crimes that she didn't commit, with the redemption of those sins being more crimes done in the name of her own oppressors. With Sasha's family continuing to still love Gaby, even after finding out the truth of what she had done to their daughter, Gaby grows to learn that her worldview was completely broken. And even in spite of recognizing the world's cruelty, with Kaya attempting to kill Gaby after learning what she had done to Sasha, Gaby still later chooses to risk her life to save Kaya from a Titan, the same way that Sasha saved her before. This moment directly coincides with what Sasha had told Kaya when first saving her, that there will be someone to help her. She may not find her right away, but to keep going until she does. And that person who ultimately helps show her this is Gaby herself. Both Gaby and Sasha parallel each other in ways that comment on the grander themes of Attack on Titan's story, and both grow in their own unique ways that reflect each other. Where Sasha ultimately learns self-acceptance through embracing the traditions of her ancestors and heritage, Gaby learns to accept herself by not letting her ancestors' sins that she wasn't responsible for define who she is. This is just one example among many within this dense story of how Attack on Titan is able to recontextualize earlier parts in the story with new information, and both characters manage to help shine a light on the themes of Attack on Titan in their own unique but distinctly parallel ways.